Howdy, I'm James Flaten with the Minnesota Space Grant, and here to talk a little bit about flight location selection for balloon flights. And let's get Mike to introduce himself, and then I will give you a quick story of how we do balloon.
Hi, and I'm Mike Walach. I am with the Montana Space Grant Consortium in Bozeman, Montana.
So it turns out that Mike and I actually have rather different practices for launch site selection, and that's good for a video of this sort. So just for the record, I'm located in Minneapolis, and launching balloons is not perhaps 100% illegal, but it's not a good idea from a metro area. So we're always out of town. And our choice historically has been think about how it's going to fly and then choose a place that makes it fly in a reasonable way for that date. So in other words, we often go to places we've never been before. We've probably scoped them out in advance by looking at aerial photography. But I'm always on the road. I'm always in a town that I haven't been before. So I don't have contacts there. I don't have familiarity, intimate familiarity with what I'm up against, but I know what I'm looking for.
Yeah, and so we're flying in Montana, Bozeman, Montana. We're surrounded by mountain ranges out here, most of them over 10,000 feet tall. We have snow for the bulk of the year, so avalanche is an issue. We have black bear, grizzly bear, mountain lion, rattlesnakes, all kinds of wonderful things in the mountains, so we don't want to land there. So we have a large area east of town where we try to land in, but we have 3 fixed launch sites, and we use airports for our launch sites. So for picking a day to fly, I know my launch sites are a known value. Where I'd like to land roughly is a known value. So the weather is the variable I'm playing with. So I'm looking at launch days, wind directions, wind patterns, and trying to see which day and weather will line up with my launch locations. So the landing is a bit of an unknown. And we have fixed launch sites. So a little bit different for what James is doing. And then the other difference is that we always operate off of airports. And the main reason for that here is we know we have access to power potentially. We know we have good cell phone coverage at the airport, and it makes an easy place for the FAA to recognize when we file NOTAMs that we're going to be launching off of an airport. And they're also pretty large, big open spaces. It does come with its set of challenges. So we don't just show up at an airport and launch, we call ahead of time. We speak with an airport manager. So an airport manager is a person that manages the property. And then in addition to that, you generally have a fixed base operator or an FBO, and that's the business entity on the airport. And it's always a good idea to give them a call as well too. Because we operate out of the same 3 airports pretty consistently, we have good working relationships. So we're not calling and telling the airport that we're going to launch from there. We're calling and asking. Technically, under FAA regs, we have access to any public airport, but you don't want to make those assumptions. It's always better to ask and build a good relationship. And then the last piece of that is just coordinating with the airport and seeing where they want you to launch. And making sure that all the members of your team understand that if you're on an active airport, you have active taxiways, you have aircraft moving around, there are definitely places that you can go and definitely places that you cannot go.
Okay, so that sets the stage, and that's actually very much news to me, as in I've never launched from an airport in my life, except when I happen to be in Montana. So, but what we're all trying to accomplish the same thing. In other words, safely get a balloon off the ground and get it to land in some place that's reasonable and appropriate without overflying or landing in places that are inappropriate. So Mike was saying that he chooses a date that makes the flight work from a specific location, launch location, or one of several. And I choose a location that makes it work on the date that I'm interested in. So again, we're getting the same thing accomplished, but in a slightly different approach. In the case of an eclipse, though, you don't get to choose either the location, the eclipse path is set, or the date, the eclipse time is set. So you'll have to figure out what to do with the advice we give you. Let me just give you some general advice, though. So you definitely want to think about where the thing is going to fly and make sure that it hopefully lands someplace that is not in a metro area and maybe not in a mountain. That's not a big problem here. Not in open water, preferably. That is a problem here of sorts, and not in a forest, and that is a big problem actually in a lot of places. You need to make sure that you don't overfly things you're not allowed to overfly or land on military bases or whatever that would frown on your presence, shall we say. And once you have an idea, whether or not you have a launch location in mind or not, once you have an idea of how the flight will proceed trajectory-wise, And here are some things to definitely consider. Number one, you definitely need cell phone service. And the reason is you need to be able to contact people. You need to be able to do tracking through internet, which you can get on your cell phone. Some of our tracking is done that way at least. You definitely need access. And so, for instance, I'm always looking for parking lots, preferably parking lots that are maybe close to either groves of trees or close to buildings so that I can get some protection from the wind if it happens to be windy. I prefer, if I can, not to take tanks out of my vehicles. And that just means that I need to be able to have a launch inflation location, which is within just literally a few feet of where I can actually get a vehicle and park it. That's sometimes tricky. So I favor public places like schools, schoolyards, parks, things like that. I do know some jurisdictions where you need written permission in advance to even be in a park. That seems strange to me, but apparently that is a thing. And wind. So wind is kind of, I'm assuming the weather is not terrible. If the weather is terrible, it's just hard to do ballooning, period. But if it's windy and yet the weather is okay, you have to pay attention to the low level winds, not so much the upper level winds while you're launching. And you really need to be able to make a good lift measurement during inflation. And that requires you to have the balloon, well, it doesn't require, but best way, or one way to do it, the way I do it is to have the balloon steady long enough that I can measure how much it's lifting, either with a scale or with a pre-weighted bucket or something like that. Very hard to do if the balloon is bobbing around a lot in the wind. And so I'm always looking for things to hide behind, like heavy foliage that works in the summer, that does not work in the winter around here in Minnesota, or more likely buildings. But buildings will redirect the wind. They won't actually stop it or damp it. And so you have to be careful that if you're hiding behind a building and then you step out from behind the building, suddenly you're back in the wind again. But once you have inflated and sealed the balloon and you know your inflation is appropriate and your lift is appropriate, you can then step out into the wind if you need to. Just make sure when you release the stack, you don't hit something. So if the balloon tips over dramatically because of prevailing wind and then you let go of the bottom of the stack, it will swing down like a pendulum and immediately strike the ground. That's not a good thing. So if it's not windy and you can raise the thing hand over hand straight above you and then let it go from the bottom payload, that's best. It's just not always practical. So people talk about a running release where you have the people holding the payloads downwind from you and you let the balloon go and it overflies the people. And the idea is they let the payloads come out of their hands and if necessary, they run with the wind, with the balloon until the balloon is high enough to lift things out of their hands. And the person who's the farthest down the line has to typically run the farthest. So that said, you need to watch out for fences. You need to watch out for, overhead wires, other obstacles that are downwind from where you're going to be releasing from.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add to what James said. I agree 100% with all of that. We tend to, being at airports, we tend to hide behind a hangar if it's an option. We've never been able to launch from inside of a hangar, which would be kind of nice to get completely out of the wind. But again, as James says, it just redirects the wind. So it's really important to understand what's going to happen when you let go of the balloon and it actually hits those surface winds. And having an idea of what your ascent rate is going to be and what your ground speed is going to be, it's fairly simple math to sort of pace out and figure out how much distance do you need to clear that tree line or those power lines. When you're starting out, you want to give yourself a lot of margin for error. Don't make assumptions as to how high you're going to go up. And if you accidentally underfill a balloon, your ascent rate is going to be a lot lower than you anticipated, and your horizontal distance is going to be a lot longer before you're going to clear an obstacle. So giving yourself a really big buffer is pretty important. And then for us, when we launch balloons, particularly if it's windy, you want your fastest runner kind of on the last payload because they tend to be the one that's going to run the fastest. We launch, like James says, we put the balloon upwind. So as the balloon is coming up, it's curving up and flying over us. So it results in a little bit less running. For wind speeds, I like to be under 10 miles an hour on launch day. As you start approaching 10, it starts to get a little more intense. 15 miles an hour is about the most I've ever launched in. And it definitely gets a lot more difficult. The challenge with wind on launch is the balloon, popping or hitting the ground. It moves around a lot. And it is really hard to get a lift measurement when the balloon is bouncing around that much. So it does help If you've done some practice launches and have a rough idea of how much helium you should be dumping into the balloon to lift so that you know that you're close. And then beyond that, it becomes a little bit of an educated guess if it's incredibly windy.
Let me just comment. Well, one thing, actually, Mike, why don't you talk a little bit about the concept of flying long or flying short, or when to cut down, especially if cut down is an option, and how it might go into your thinking about flight trajectories and launch site location.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, particularly with being surrounded by challenging terrain, if I do a flight prediction, I'm not just looking at where we're launching from and where we're landing. I'm looking at everything that's underneath us along the way, because your flight prediction assumes that everything goes to plan. You could have a leak in the balloon, you could have a hole, you could have some sort of an issue where the flight's going to terminate early. So you want to think about where you're going to land if you end up landing prematurely. How confident are you in your hardware that you're launching and your launching abilities to know that if you make a mistake and you land short, are you going to end up somewhere that's going to be difficult or even impossible to recover? And that doesn't necessarily just mean rough terrain. It could be restricted airspace, military facilities, things like that, large populated cities. You really don't want to drop a balloon into a highly densely populated metropolitan area. So considering all of those things as you're doing your balloon trajectory. And then the other thing that I pay attention to on launches is I watch our tracking as we're going up and get a sense of which direction we're traveling through different wind layers. So if we have a failure and we have to terminate early, I know we're going to come down under parachute and we're going to be in the same wind layers that we went up through. And I have a pretty good idea of which direction we're going to travel. And sometimes you may have to, even though you want to terminate the flight, you may just have to hold on for a few minutes to clear a piece of terrain or obstacle that you don't want to land in. At the end of the day, the safety of your team is the top priority. If I have to lose a payload, we'll lose a payload, but we're going to try to make every attempt to keep the team safe, but also to keep people safe on the ground. If I'm going to cut down and I'm over a pretty highly populated area and I have a parachute failure, my payload might hit the ground at 50 miles an hour, and we don't want to hit people or property on the ground. That's our duty. The FAA requires us to protect people and property on the ground. So you've got to take every reasonable precaution to make sure that you're not doing any undue harm or taking any undue risks to people on the ground. So all that becomes, your job as doing flight prediction is thinking of all these contingencies that could happen as well too.
Sure. So I agree with all of that. On the other hand, I'll say it's hard. In fact, it's not likely that you can come up with a flight prediction where you could land anywhere. It's like our flight predictions, and most flight predictions, I think, will overfly some things that you would rather not land on. But thinking about that, and it's like, yeah, if I only move this a little bit south, in my case, moving the launch location, I won't overfly that town. And maybe I would just prefer not to overfly the town. I could overfly it or not. And I thought it was going to be fine, but hey, why don't I just not overfly that town if I have the option?
Yeah, and I'll just add one quick caveat to that too is, yeah, I agree. It's impossible to have areas, you're always going to have something that you don't want to land on. For us, we're right next to Yellowstone National Park. That's an absolute hard no. I wouldn't tolerate any flight over the park because that's massive fines if we accidentally land in there. But going over mountainous terrain for a little bit, where maybe we're going to lose the payload is different than, facing massive fines from the Park Service.
And obviously, if you land someplace that you weren't planning to, you should tell people that was not the plan. Help me out here. And so in the case of a park or a military facility or whatever, maybe don't expect them to say yes, but I would say at least approach them and just say, sorry, we landed something. It's over there. And I know you normally don't let people go over there, but could we possibly go in there? Could you possibly help us or send somebody in there with us? And sometimes it works and sometimes you just have to walk away, but definitely try to find who is in charge and see if they're willing to let you recover, but certainly try not to have that happen to you. Let me share my screen and just make some comments about things that are kind of eclipse specific. So here's the eclipse path for the 2023 eclipse. And I had somebody run some predictions for me. And so let me just zoom in on this. And so I said, what would happen if I were to fly from Socorro, New Mexico, which happens to be near Albuquerque? And so what she did is she did predictions for the eclipse date, and I believe the day before and the day after, so that time of year, for several years. And so that's why there's a bunch of predictions here. And you'll notice that some of these predictions actually overfly the path altogether. And some of these predictions don't even enter the path at all. And the launch location that I proposed is not in the path. I guess I post this or bring this up by saying you have to be flexible as much as you can. I really would discourage you saying, I'm going to launch from Albuquerque no matter what. The reason is Albuquerque might be a fine place to launch from on the years or on the days that the flight trajectory is going to the southeast, but it's a really lousy place to launch from on the years or the days that the trajectory goes to the northeast, because then it will fly right out of the eclipse path even before it reaches altitude. One more thing, if I zoom in a little bit more, notice White Sands Missile Range is not far away from this particular proposed launch site, and I will definitely be watching White Sands carefully. I've been told that White Sands is not as bad as you might think. There are people who do flights out of Socorro pretty regularly, and they talk to the White Sands people when they need to, but I'm sure it's a better day when they don't need to. So this said, scope out your locations as you can, perhaps with aerial photography, months in advance, that's fine. But don't expect to be able to really finalize what you're going to be up against until a few days in advance. I usually start running final predictions a week in advance every day at the appropriate time of day for the eclipse. In this case, I know the time of day, and I wait for it to settle. And so if from one day to the next, it's not changing very much, I think that that's probably pretty settled weather. But if it's changing a lot because a weather system is moving through, I keep predicting. And sometimes I don't make my final decisions until the day before. And occasionally I will even change things on the day of a launch. It's like, nope, I really need to shift everything to the south because things are not flying as far as I need them to, and I don't want to land there. So again, think about launch sites, think about what you need for a launch site. But in the case of an eclipse where you don't have much choice for the timing and don't have any choice for the timing and the date, really, you need to be ready to go with the flow. And in this particular case, I noticed the flow can go in a lot of different directions. And I don't know which one I'm going to get. So I might tell my team, it's like, look, if we had a to the northeast flight, what would you do? And if we had it to the the southeast flight, what would you do differently? And maybe at least have those two in my pocket ready to go. And in both cases, I might say Socorro's not it. We're going to be lodged in Socorro, but we're not actually going to launch from there. In either case, perhaps.
Yeah, and I'll just add, James sort of mentioned this briefly. When we're doing weather predictions or flight predictions as we start to get close, for me, it's a bit of a confidence game. And if I see 3 days worth of predictions, so if I look at the day before, the day of, and the day after, and my predictions are pretty much showing me the same path, my weather patterns looking pretty much the same, I feel fairly confident. But if I see a big change in the weather where my prediction is going to be wildly different the day before, or the day of, or the day after, my confidence level goes down. Weather predictions, they're definitely not perfect. And the further out you go, of course, the less accurate they are. But when you have a big change in the weather, like James says, if there's a storm system moving through, a low pressure system, high pressure system that's going to move through and drastically change the weather pattern, it's really hard to predict, even down, to a 24-hour window of what that prediction path is actually going to do. Again, looking for launch sites. When I'm launching here at home, I'm very familiar with the terrain and the places and the types of places I can launch from. If I'm looking to go somewhere new, I might be looking for different pieces of public land. So in the West, you have a lot of different types of public land, and some of it is good to go, and some of it you need to avoid. So Bureau of Land Management is generally pretty good. You can do a lot of things on BLM land that you can't do elsewhere. It's pretty wide open. The caveat to that is it's going to be remote and you may not have that cell phone access. So it might make a good launch site, but it might not necessarily make a good tracking site to have your ground station set up. State land is generally okay. In some states like Montana, you do have to pay to have a permit to access state land. So if you're out of state, that might not be an option for you. The things that you want to avoid are national parks, national wildlife refuges, and in some instances, national forest land. Some of those are going to restrict access for activities such as launching a balloon. Doesn't necessarily mean they're a no-go, but you would definitely want to touch base with your local National Park Service or National Forest Service office to see if that's going to be an option as far as launching is going to go. But again, having a couple of different places in mind ahead of time that you know are going to be good. You don't want to be running around on launch day trying to find a new site that you haven't done at least a little bit of forward research on.
Well, thanks, Mike. Hopefully this has given you lots of things to think about and lots of things to practice. Eclipse flying is trickier than normal, but hopefully our ideas here for you, both for general launch site selection and then also some things that are kind of specific to eclipses. One thing that Mike said that is actually kind of important for eclipse flights in particular is, if possible, try to get to know or get in touch with somebody familiar with where you're going, especially if it's a place you're not that familiar with. And so if you're going to Nebraska, I'm sorry, not Nebraska, if you're going to Montana, then you should talk to Mike, although I don't think you're going to Montana because none of the eclipses go through Montana. But for instance, he could certainly give you some pointers about what to do or maybe what not to do. I remember talking to somebody from Louisiana who said, no, I would never go onto a property without at least finding the person because they have guns. And it's like, that's not how things go here in Minnesota, but okay. Good thing I talked to you if I were to ever be in Louisiana and be trying to do those activities, because he knows what he's talking about for his neck of the woods. But launch sites, generally speaking, I sometimes joke about this is the easy part. This is the part that you can choose in advance and kind of have some control over. Landing sites, that's the much less predictable part. Maybe that's the funner part, but obviously you need to come up with some plan that has a launch site and has a landing zone that you can possibly get to and get your stuff back. And so again, we wish you well in your planning and in your preparation. Any final words, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely agree with everything James says. You know, we didn't talk a whole lot about landing because this was more on picking, you know, launch sites and flight prediction, but you know, making landowner, you know, here in Montana, we try to get landowner permission before we go on to private land. Sometimes it's not possible to get a hold of them ahead of time. And, you know, sometimes we're driving up to a strange house and knocking on the door to let them know why we're there. Generally, we use the word just weather balloon. I'll say, you know, my team of students launched a weather balloon. It's landed on your property and would like your permission to go retrieve it. And they understand that. We don't get into the nitty gritty of everything that we're doing. Just a weather balloon is, people generally have an understanding of what that's going to be. Yeah, landing sites are, they're tricky. They're the wild card that you can't really control. Having some local knowledge is definitely best. And, you know, for Eclipse, you're probably going to be somewhere that's not on your home turf. And it's always good to connect with somebody local, get some local knowledge, and just sort of know, you know, what the process is for that area. So we wish you all the best of luck. Flying on an eclipse is a challenge. You know, odds are some of us aren't going to be successful. We're going to have things that are outside of our control, whether it be weather or mechanical or other logistics. But hope our information here was helpful for you today, and that we wish you the best of luck and success with your eclipse flights. Thank you.
Sure. So one final comment, there are actually several videos, and both of us are in some of the other ones too, talking about contingency planning and also talking about recovery. So I encourage you, in addition to thinking about launch sites, you watch some of the other videos on other topics.